Frostbite testing. Test subjects were taken outside in freezing weather and doused with water until their limbs froze. The frozen limbs were then subjected to different methods of rewarming to study the effects of frostbite treatment. These methods included dousing the limb with hot water, holding the limb close to an open fire, leaving the subject untreated overnight. These methods were part of the cruel experiments conducted by Unit 731, where captives' limbs were submerged in ice water until they froze, after which these rewarming techniques were applied to study the effects. Pathogen testing. In the pathogen testing conducted by Unit 731, subjects were deliberately infected with a variety of deadly diseases to study their effects on the human body. The specific diseases used in these experiments included bubonic plague, typhoid fever, yellow fever, typhus, chicken pox, and list goes on. These experiments were part of Unit 731's broader research into biological warfare and were conducted without regard for the well-being or consent of the subjects, leading to many deaths and severe illnesses. Vivisection. In the vivisection experiments conducted by Unit 731, individuals were dissected alive without anesthesia. The purpose was to study the effects of diseases on the human body and to observe the natural progression of these diseases, as well as the effects of various injuries on living organs. These inhumane procedures often resulted in extreme suffering and death for the subjects, which involved performing surgical operations on living organisms without anesthesia for experimental purposes, led to immense suffering, mutilation, and death for the subjects. Weapon testing. In the weapon testing experiments conducted by Unit 731, victims were tied to stakes and used as live targets to test the effectiveness of various biological and chemical weapons, including plague bombs, chemical weapons, grenades, and flamethrowers. The specific biological and chemical weapons tested on live targets by Unit 731 included biological weapons like anthrax, plague, Yersinia pestis, cholera, typhoid, botulinum toxin, smallpox, tetrodotoxin, and chemical weapons included cyanide, mustard gas, sulfur mustard, phosgene, lewisite, hydrogen, cyanide, VX, gas, sarin, gas. High-pressure chamber tests. In the high-pressure chamber tests conducted by Unit 731, subjects were placed in large pressure chambers where the pressure was gradually increased until their bodies could no longer withstand the intense conditions, often leading to death. These experiments were designed to study the effects of extreme pressure on the human body, contributing to the understanding of how high-pressure environments could impact human physiology. This research was intended to understand the limits of human endurance and the potential impact of high-pressure environments, which could be relevant in military scenarios such as deep-sea or high-altitude operations. Seawater injections. In the seawater injection experiments conducted by Unit 731, researchers injected prisoners with seawater to investigate its viability as a substitute for saline solution. This was done under the premise of finding an alternative for medical saline in situations where it might be scarce. However, these injections frequently led to infections, severe health complications, and the death of the subjects. The body's reaction to the injection of seawater, which is not sterile and has a different salinity compared to human blood, could lead to shock, organ failure, and ultimately death due to the body's inability to cope with the imbalance. Temperature tests. In the temperature tests conducted by Unit 731, subjects were exposed to extreme conditions of both heat and cold to study the human body's response to temperature variations. This involved submerging limbs in ice water to induce frostbite and using high temperatures to observe the effects of heat on the human physiology. These experiments were part of a broader series of brutal tests aimed at understanding how environmental factors affect human endurance and survival. These experiments aimed to gather data on how temperature extremes could affect soldiers' survivability and performance in various environmental conditions. Syphilis and gonorrhoea. Testing. In the syphilis and gonorrhoea testing conducted by Unit 731, individuals were deliberately infected with these sexually transmitted diseases. The purpose was to study the progression and potential treatments of syphilis and gonorrhoea, often conducted without the subject's consent or knowledge. These unethical experiments aimed to understand the effects of these diseases on the human body, but resulted in significant suffering and long-term health consequences for the victims. These experiments, which took place between 1946 and 1948, involved the deliberate infection of over 1,300 individuals with sexually transmitted diseases, including syphilis and gonorrhea, without their consent. The subjects included prisoners, soldiers, psychiatric patients, and sex workers. Crush syndrome. In the crush syndrome experiments conducted by Unit 731, heavy objects were deliberately dropped on bound victims to study crush injuries. This was intended to simulate the effects of debris falling on people during bombings. The primary goal was to understand the physiological responses and potential survival strategies under such extreme conditions, often resulting in severe injuries or death for the subjects involved.